Question number 29 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. What can be reasonably inferred about gliding animals from the past? This is a tough one. Inferred. Inferred means not directly stated but implied or inferred. Based on the evidence that we're given, what's the next logical step that we can draw based on what was said? What can reasonably be inferred about gliding animals? Well, this is a quote question, so we have the quotes to help us with 30. That's good. Let's see if we can answer this. What can be inferred about gliding animals? I mean, I do remember, okay, we know a gliding animal is something from tree down theory, right? The tree down theory assumes from the blurb that they were climbers that leaped and glided among branches. So that's what a glider is. It's like you kind of just like coast from a high position to a lower position. We know that these game birds, these partridges, they jump around, right? They jump up like popcorn. They would flap their half-formed wings and take short hops in the air. That's more of the ground-up theory, if we remember from the blurb. Ground-up theory assumes that birds were fleet-footed ground dwellers that captured prey by leaping and flapping their upper limbs. And furthermore, I do remember at the end, because the passage was all about how these birds used wing-assisted inclined running. They flap their wings in order to push hard on the ground. So, in an evolutionary context, let's read line 69. WAIR takes on surprising explanatory powers. With one fell swoop, the dials came up with a viable origin for the flapping flight stroke of birds, something gliding animals don't do. So if gliding animals don't flap, they're not going to be, that's one thing gliding birds don't do. They don't flap, their wings stay and they kind of soar. And their wings are used kind of as airplane wings. And an aerodynamic function for half-form wings, one of the main drawbacks to the ground-up hypothesis. So the aerodynamic function for half-form wings is maybe a little bit like the gliding thing. They just use these half-form wings, not really for propulsion, but just for stability. This is a hard question. What can be reasonably inferred about gliding animals? So we only care about gliding animals. Gliding animals, gliding animals. That's the only thing we care about. Their young tend to hop along beside their parents instead of flying beside them. We don't know that's true about gliding animals. We know that's true about pheasants, quail, tinamous, and other ground birds, that they run along beside their parents. But we don't know that gliding animals fly beside their parents. Don't know that. And that's kind of weird, because you would expect gliding animals to have their young that fly beside them, not hop along them, because if you're gliding, then you're not going to be on the ground. So that A is kind of a weird reversal of the meaning. Young tend to hop. We would expect gliding animal young to fly. What about B? What can reasonably be inferred about gliding animals from the passage? Their methods of locomotion is similar to that of ground birds. No, that's not true. Their locomotion, the way that they move, is they use their wings to glide for stability, but ground birds use their wings to create downforce. So I don't think that their method of movement is similar to that of ground birds. I think they're fundamentally different. What about C? What can be inferred about gliding animals? They use the ground for feeding more often than for perching. We don't really talk about the natural environment of the gliding animals so much. We don't talk about that they use ground for feeding more often than for perching. We don't know the frequency of their habitats or when they prefer one type of existence over another. Man, this is weird. What can be reasonably inferred about gliding animals? They do not use a flapping stroke to aid in climbing slopes. Probably. I think it's going to be D. Why? D is saying, so we say, what can be reasonably inferred? What's the next logical step that we can take based on the information we know about gliding animals? Gliding animals do not use a flapping stroke to aid in climbing slopes. Because don't we know that from line 72 or 71, the dials came up with a viable origin for the flapping flight stroke of birds. So birds that flap is something gliding animals don't do. So the birds that are flapping in order to create downforce is a strike against the tree down theory of gliding, because gliding birds do not flap their wings. They don't use WAIR. They don't put downforce on the ground in order to keep their feet planted. This is tough. And I think that's going to be the answer. What can be reasonably inferred about gliding animals? They do not use a flapping stroke. Ground up birds use a flapping stroke. Gliding birds do not. They use their wings as stationary kind of stability devices. I think the answer for number 29 is going to be D. Please, let's look at the answer for 30 too, so we can better understand how this makes sense. So again, I think the answer 29 is going to be D. Let's look at the quotes. Question number 30, on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. So question 30 is the support for question 29. Question 29 was asking what can be reasonably inferred about gliding animals. So we only care about gliding animals and what can we infer from those. And we think that the answer is going to be D, that gliding animals do not use a flapping stroke to aid in climbing. Because if we remember at the end of the piece, they say the origin story of flapping birds is something gliding animals don't do. So if gliding animals, it says don't flap, then what can be inferred about gliding animals? They do not use a flapping stroke to aid in climbing because they don't flap at all. But let's pretend like we don't know the answer for 29. Let's pretend like none of the answers exist. Let's answer a very particular question that's being posed in 29. What can be inferred about gliding animals? What can be inferred about gliding animals? 4 to 6. Does this talk about gliding animals? They jumped up like popcorn, he said, describing how they would flap their half-formed wings and take short hops in the air. That's not about gliding animals, that's about flapping animals. So that's not talking about gliding, because if we know from the blurb, gliding animals are tree down, that they climb and then they leap and they glide to a nearest, to their next location. Ground up theory, though, is when the birds flapped. So these little popcorn, half-formed wing short hops in the air, those are ground up. Flappers. What about 28 to 29? Does this talk about gliding animals? They really only use the ground for feeding and traveling. That's not related to gliding animals at all. There's no implied thing that, because these flapping birds only use the ground for feeding and traveling, that has no logical connection with what gliders do as a result. Maybe they do that too. I'm not liking B either. What about C, 57 to 59? Does this talk about what gliders do? The birds were doing the very same thing with their wings to help them scramble up otherwise impossible slopes. That's what the flapping wing birds. They're using their wings as downforce. The birds were doing the very same thing with their wings to help them scramble up otherwise impossible slopes. They were using, like the spoiler in a Formula 1 car does, to keep them planted. Again, it doesn't talk about gliding animals. So this is why the quote is actually much easier to answer in this question in a way first than looking at the answers for 29. This is a very hard question, but I think it's actually answered through the quote in 30. D, 72, 74. Does this talk about gliding animals? With one fell swoop, the dials came up with a viable origin for the flapping flight stroke of birds, something gliding animals don't do, and thus a shortcoming of the tree down theory. Viable origin for the flapping flight stroke of birds. So flapping has to do with downforce on surfaces. Flapping is something gliding animals don't do. So what can be inferred about gliding animals? D for number 29. They do not use a flapping stroke to aid in climbing slopes because they don't use a flapping motion, period. That's what they said. That's said in 30D. So the answer to number 30 is D. Answer to 29 is also D. Very hard question.